All right, so last year, after the conference, a lot of the committee members went out to dinner, and Kevin Wells, who was a speaker last year, he joined us. And Ken started throwing out ideas, and Aaron started throwing out ideas for next year's theme, this year. And Kevin Wells, when he heard the idea of the 4 last things, he thought that that sounded great. And so we started talking about it, he got enthusiastic, and it seemed like we couldn't leave him out. And so he is here as kind of like one of the main people who inspired the theme this year. So it's really wonderful to welcome Kevin Wells back to the conference. Yeah. So we want to thank all of our speakers for working with that theme. Kevin, though, he's going to take us into the depths of hell in marriage. And he's going to tell us the story of escape as he dives into his new book, The Hermit, the priest who saved a soul, a marriage, and a family. Kevin is an acclaimed Catholic writer, speaker, and former award-winning sports writer. He's the author of several books, including The Hermit, but also Priest and Beggar, The Heroic Life of Venerable Aloysius Schwartz, and The Priests We Need to Save the Church or Burst, a story of God's grace when life falls apart. And again, he's going to share a lot about his latest bestseller, The Hermit. So, brothers, let's welcome back to the Connecticut Catholic Men's Conference, Kevin Wells.
Yeah, I was encouraging last year at that dinner. I still remember that. But the great thing about my encouragement is Peter, Steve, and Father Wade took care of it, so I'm lazy man right now. They locked it down. They explained it. I mean, you're not going to do much better than those three. Really, that triumvirate. So really, I can be lazy with the 4 last things. And the wonderful thing for me, coming last, is this. So maybe, if some of you men were here last year, I know there were, because I've been speaking to a lot of guys today that were here, you might remember the brain aneurysm that I mentioned that almost killed me, and that my near-death experience led me to an intensification of prayer life, praying the rosary more frequently, adoration, weekday masses, everything changed, right? Everything changed because this close to dying in 2009. But the talk I gave last year was covered over by a secret. For me, it was the biggest secret in the world. You guys don't know. My dear Krista, my dear wife Krista, after my brain surgery, began to binge drink red wine in secret. And for 8 or so years, until the saving year of 2020, that awful year of the pandemic, I really did seem to awaken most days in seeming hell. You know, the secret I didn't tell you is I was trapped in a long wintertime. So, Connecticut men, I didn't share with you, obviously, I didn't share with you the story of Krista because I didn't want to hurt Krista or bring attention to the seeming hell of our lives, my family's life, and what I saw as a piecemeal disintegration of my wife, body and soul. Then one day in 2022, 2 years ago, 2 years after Krista was healed by a holy priest turned hermit who took a spiral staircase deep down into the casket of her shame, that Krista said the most remarkable thing to me. She said, Kevin, I want to expose me. I want to expose my darkness so the work of Father Flume can be exposed. Tell the story of how Father Flume showed no fear during COVID-19. Write to people about what he did to save my life, of how a man behaves. My answer, no. You're nuts. Krista, I can't do this because I exposed the pus of our lives. Kevin, I want you to do this. Months went by, I didn't do anything, and finally she said one day, Kevin, you're praying about it is delaying. I'm not going away. So I began to write. This is the result. So I'm Irish, and the Irish sometimes tend to embellish. This was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Truly, writing this book was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. But my wife told me to. And the Holy Spirit was urging me. So gentlemen, I speak to you this afternoon. What's today? I don't know, September 20th. For the first time, I'm going to tell this haunted story. And it falls perfectly in line with what we talked about last year at this time at dinner. The 4 last things. Why? Because I live the 4 last things. And I want to show you how the 4 last things, we keep hearing about it. The 3 previous speakers talk about the 4 last things to come, right? No. The 4 last things can come onto this side of eternity where our souls are brought face to face with Jesus, but unfortunately also Satan. So I'll speak today of death, judgment, heaven, and hell, but I'm going to spend a really good amount of time on hell. Then we'll get to heaven. So you might remember last year I think I told you gentlemen that I had just turned 40 years old, and I'd been going on this retreat for, 20, 30 years with my family. And it was a weekend retreat during Advent. And this particular retreat, I guess because I just turned 40 years old, wherever I went, was this poking awareness that I wasn't getting it done. Now, you're getting older, Kevin. You're 40 years old, and some of these habits you have, they're not going away. You have too much measure of pride, and there's sloth in your life. And you know what? You can love Krista better and your kids better, and there's just things that aren't right. I don't think it was caught up in really any serious sin, but it was this poking awareness. You're not living out God's will as a mature Catholic man, and shame on you. And this retreat house is sat on like 250 acres. It's way out in the countryside. It sits up on a cliffside of Maryland. It overlooks a wide expanse of the Potomac River. And I always have this sort of routine. I've been doing it for 3 decades, where on the last night of the retreat, around midnight, I walk down to the banks of the Potomac River. And on this particular night, because it's in the country, you really can see the Milky Way. But there was a full moon, and as I was walking down this hill to the river, the full moon was sort of like God's swinging lantern saying, oh, he's coming back again. Yeah, he's going to bring the same stuff he brought last year and the year before and the year before. The jig is up because it doesn't work. He goes home from this thing feeling like Peter post-Pentecost or William Wallace and Braveheart. But the moment he gets home, the first nuisance, maybe he makes it to the 3rd nuisance, it all breaks away and shatters, and he's the same guy. So Kevin, what do you got this year? Because we know what the reality of this thing is. Your little midnight routine on the dock by the water. And so I'm standing down there, and this awareness washed over me. And I said, you fool, you hypocrite, you loser. You're back again. It was almost like God was sitting on a stool, stroking his beard, looking down upon me, shaking his head. What do you got this time? Because we know it doesn't work. And a thought came to me. I remember the waves were slapping up against the dock. And it was cold out. It was windy. And I remember this thought came to me. And it certainly, 100%, I imagine, came from the Holy Spirit, because it had never once occurred to me in my life. And it was this: God, you sent your Son into the world to endure violence, to redeem all of humanity. Hey, God, maybe it can work that way for me. Maybe you need to strike me down so I can be renewed. So God, I want you to flatten me. I want you to make it violent. Because I imagine when it hurts and I'm on the ground, that awareness is going to come And I want to be provoked to transformation. So God, make it violent. And I knew when I made the prayer, because my parents, I'm from a large family of 10, my parents had always told me that God always answered this type of prayer 100% of the time. And I knelt on the dock that night and I cried, because it was a good cry, because I knew the other shoe was going to drop. I didn't know when, I didn't care, I didn't know what fashion, but I knew it was going to drop. And exactly a month later, almost to the exact ticking second, I had a brain aneurysm. It was like somebody took a tomahawk and flung it into the back of my skull. My brain exploded. I had an arteriovenous malformation, and I came this close. They rushed me to the hospital, and they kept jamming these shunts in my head to try and get the drowned blood out from crushing my brain, and they kept clotting, and it wasn't working, and they couldn't go into my head to give me surgery because it was too deep. It was bad, and I had awareness. I couldn't move, I had headaches, I couldn't speak. The brain injury had rendered everything obsolete, but I could understand that I was dying. And they kept putting me in these CAT scans, these CT scans, these tubes. And the third time I was put in, when you're in there, they can chart the blood better. They can to try and like embolize it and glue it. So this third time I was in, they gave me a contrast, and when they gave me this contrast, I had a reaction. So I'm in the tube, and I start to vomit. And I couldn't tell the nurses to take me out because I couldn't speak. And all of a sudden, thoughts of dying from a brain bleed, from an aneurysm, turned to thoughts of choking to death. And then judgment. So we just talked about death, right? This close to death. So we're going to move on to judgment, the second last thing. As the vomit rose, I said, I got 15 seconds, 30 seconds, maybe I'll make it to a minute, but I am going to be judged by Jesus Christ very soon. And I was too comfortable. I didn't love Krista with everything in my tank. I had more to give. I wasn't thinking about the whoppers of sins of my past. I didn't care at that moment. It didn't matter about my sins of commission. It was what I did not do. I didn't love well enough. I was too stinking comfortable. And that's not a good conversation to have with Jesus Christ on the throne. I swallowed down the vomit because I wasn't eating anyway, and I survived the night. And then 2 days later, because nothing else was working, they put me into the surgical room, and surgeons went into the back of my head. And after 7 hours, 8 hours, they came out and told Krista, we can't go any further because he'll die. We can't get to the malformation. We got a few bleeders, but we can't get to the malformation. So this was the day for me to die. Krista, I was incapacitated, obviously. Krista called my uncle, Monsignor Thomas Wells. He was murdered in his rectory in Maryland in the year 2000. One of my best friends, my dad's brother. Called Monsignor Wells' best friend, Father Jim Stack, who had a healing ministry, and said, Father Stack, come to Baltimore. Kevin's going to die. He just had failed brain surgery. Krista will be there in an hour. And Father Stack was up here right now, and he had this microphone. Here's what he say happened, because I was incapacitated. He came into my neuro ICU room in the 7th floor of University of Maryland Medical Center. That's the floor where people died. And the room was dark, and it was cold, and he knelt down on my bedside with his assistant. And he said, he told me softly, hey, Kevin, we've been praying to the saints, asking for their intercessions. Is there any saint that we can call on for you now? And he said that I whispered, bring my uncle down, bring Tommy down. And he stood up like a V8 moment, went to the foot of my bed, and everything changed. The lights that weren't there began to pop. His assistant almost fainted. And the entire temperature of the room changed from this cold neuro ICU room, death place, to this all-encompassing warmth Like when you come in from a cold night in Connecticut and sit by the fire, and Father Stack said, I knew I was standing in the midst of something supernatural, but here's what I knew was a miracle. I saw sort of in a horseshoe fashion around your bedside the heavenly court, some of the heavenly court, and Tommy, my uncle, Monsignor Thomas Wells, his best friend was standing next to me. And when I told him, Tommy, your nephew just asked you to save his life, save it, or he dies, and he was there and he was smiling, I knew it was all gone. I know what the doctor said, I heard what Krista said, I know all your family out in the hallway, what they were saying, but I knew it was gone, and he was right. All of it was gone the next day. They put me back in the CT scan, the blood, the fluids, the arteriovenous malformation, gone. Get home, go home. You're good. We don't know why. Get out of the hospital. Live your life. What happens? What happens when you get home? Well, everything changes, right? God had answered my prayer. Hey, God, make it violent. You made it violent. I survived. The love story begins. God, thank you. You woke me up to the reality of my comfort. Finally, the stupid dockside prayer at the Loyola Retreat House, finally we can kill it. And I actually can begin to live a life of virtue and holiness. I can give what's in my tank now. Thanks, God. Thank you for hitting the button of the love story. So, what do? I begin to spend more time in adoration. I joined prison ministry. I started men's group. That man is you. All the jazz that we know. Daily rosaries, weekday masses, all that stuff. Loving Krista more, kids more, giving them all I could. All of my tank, hey, I'm yours. It's easy for me right now to end this talk. And I could put a shiny ribbon and a bow on this presentation and end it right now. I could say, well, gentlemen, this is what hell felt like. It rained down on me, all the shunts in my head, the violence, the near-death aneurism, the blood that kept pouring into my brain to drown it. Yeah, man, that's hell. That's number 3. That's 3. But of course, and then there's heaven because Father Stack prayed and a miracle happened and I'm standing right here so I can put the bow on it and let's go home. Let's go home to our wives. Let's get a good dinner. I could do that. But that was the secret of last year. I could do that, but it would be a lie. And it would be lazy and it would be shallow of me to do it. You see, I had it all wrong after surviving my brain aneurysm. I thought back then that my encounter with death was God's answer for my prayer for violence on the dock. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. I didn't know anything then. When I requested his violence, what he actually was doing was he was preparing me for what would unfold for the next 8 years of my life. The feeling of hell, it hadn't moved in yet. The type of hell that makes brain aneurysms and failed surgery and shunts all over your head clotting up seem like flea bites. God would only answer my dockside prayer and show me the fullness of the furnace of his love only when I died to everything I thought I knew about love, to trust him alone when Krista began to binge drink. So man, I'm going to core drill down now into hell. I want to show you what hell resembles on this side of eternity. I've talked to 3 men already today who told me stories of hell. I can't believe one of the stories I heard a couple hours ago. I know that there's men that came in today, dozens, a couple hundred, I don't know, with blue whale-sized crosses on your back. I know there's men who stepped into this auditorium with unspeakable pain, you came today as beggars. You're just pleading with God, hey, you know what, honey, I'm going to go to this Connecticut men's conference because, oh yeah, go ahead, whatever. Well, interiorly, you came here because you were begging God to give you the answer that would finally take the stinking cross away. Just a ray of light into the casket of your agony that won't go away. These men that spoke to me earlier and other men I didn't speak to, you're living in seeming hells. And I love every single one of you in a very special way because I was you. And like you, I had this smallest pinhole of light. Like this little pilot light that was always blinked on in me during those awful years, those wintertime years. There was always that hope to come into things like this, that light would begin finally to grow and answers from God would come. And that's why I stand here right now, to speak of hell, and because Krista told me to. Better yet, the Holy Spirit since then has urged me to open up thoughts on what can lead you out of this unremitting desert, this long winter time that simply not only will not leave, but just gets worse. But the wonderful thing about hell on this side is you can get out. So I will share with you now how Satan and his chorus of demons can be confronted face to face and how peace can begin to really unfold in your lives. How that pinhole of light will become a torchlight that will lead you out of your cave. It is possible. Why? Because God is always faithful when you pray to him, when you come to the Connecticut Men's Conference on your knees saying, God, give me a word, just one stinking word. The evil one worked in a fever pitch to burn everything down in my life. As an old baseball writer, I was told always to bring readers into the game through my stories. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to bring you into hell and Satan's hydra-headed machinations to destroy me. I would cut off one head while another head was coming back. I learned how to beat him this way, well, he was going to come another way. He wanted my family in hell. Here's how it happened. Here's how it started. When I got home from the hospital, everything took on a new light, and I began to go more intensely to God. I wanted to spend more time in his presence at the foot of the monstrance, walking my neighborhood with a rosary, loving everyone I could in a weird way, not a weird way, a beautiful way. At job sites, I was no longer seeing men in front of me. I was seeing souls. I was no longer seeing people, I was seeing souls. So why does Krista start drinking? After 10 years of marriage, why did she mysteriously start to binge drink red wine in secret? Well, I think my newborn fervor scared her a little bit. But more importantly, neither she knew it and I didn't know it either, but a mother wound had opened up in her. She felt for the first time in our marriage that I was going places that she couldn't go or didn't know how to go to. And then the shame that she felt as a small child suddenly began to rear up. And everything began to change in her life. It's been said earlier by some of the men, the essence of Satan is to lie, disrupt, and destroy. So of course, I really think Satan loves one of the things that Satan really loves is the mother wound. Because when mom picks on you at the age of 7, well, why are you riding a horse instead of joining cheerleading? You got a little extra weight here. Or when the mother wound comes in, then all of a sudden as a little 7, 8-year-old girl with pigtails, you're like, well, I guess I can't be loved by anybody. Satan digs the talons in at the age of 7 or 8. So Satan began to whisper into Krista's ear, hey, you're not good enough. Look at Kevin. You don't measure up. Then little by little began to goad her that her relief from this shame was secret drinking. Little by little, as the frequency of the drinking unfolded, that at the time I didn't know, I felt the street lights in our marriage beginning to blink out. I remember the first night, the first light went out. After a third wine bottle had turned up in an odd place, I asked Krista, please, honey, I love you. What's going on, man? It's the third time I found a bottle, and I don't, what's happening? And neither of us spoke for several minutes. She remained motionless, and her eyes were cast down. And I remember thinking that the silence was her sort of pausing to piece together the right words to bear her broken soul. And I remember hoping then that a wound would be exposed, and she would share a hidden shame that was causing her to drink. And I imagined in the silence soon holding my wife, embracing her, as she cried trapped tears of pain that were trapped way too long in her. And I imagined looking at her through her eyes filled with tears and telling her, hey, Chris, we're going to beat this together. We're going to overcome it. We got it, sweetie. And then she spoke. Why do you always make a big deal of everything? Why are you picking on me? So, I was caught flat-footed, and after a suitable response, I said defensively, so, Chris, a hidden wine bottle, that's not a big deal? Don't attack me! Don't you dare attack me, Kevin! She said it in a tone I had never heard in our 10 years of marriage. It's always like you're looking for reasons to attack me, to go after me, to pick on me. Krista, sweetie, I'm not attacking you. I'm just trying to ask about these bottles. Oh, so you're spying on me now. Holy Kevin likes to spy on his wife. Oh, God must be so proud of you for how you love me. Thanks for your concern. But I tell you what, why don't you just butt out? And the back and forth continued for a long while. And as our voices rose, the walls began to push forward and seemed to sweat. And I wondered if my children upstairs, Gabby, Sean, and Shannon, were cupping their ears up against the door. Frightened. I will never forget the fury of that first fight when Satan entered our home. When sheets of lightning seemed to rip open from the sky and wickedness filled the room. Our words struck me as spiritually cursed, as if a demon ventriloquist commandeered, tainted, and steered everything we said. Krista received my words as malicious personal rattlesnake strikes and immediately moved to delegitimize anything I said. And I remember as she did this, that the ceiling fan seemed to pick up in intensity, and its blades were like 1 inch over my head. Everything in the room was changing, shifting. Everything was sweating. And that fight marked the night that reason and the loving language of matrimonial bond of a husband and wife began to slowly leak from our home. I witnessed a side to my wife that I had never seen. She was guided, or seemed to be guided, by a force that had removed her gentle nature and even had taken control of her entire being. This was the evening when everything changed in our marriage and home, and the fight became the template for each fight that followed when another bottle turned up. I didn't know it then, and Krista didn't know either, of the Olympian magnitude of her decades-old unhealed shame, and that her drinking was the manner that Satan encouraged her to kill it. By the way, I'm not really a supernaturalist. I'm certainly not obsessed with the unseen or the inexplicable that we can't understand, but I will tell you that Satan is real. and I saw him. If you read this book, you'll understand that Satan is on this side. I imagine everyone in this room understands that Satan's a part of all this, right? I saw him. Satan works masterfully. He gives birth to masterpieces where he takes a beautiful, meek, humble, kind woman, gets into that wound, and says, I own you now. I also believe that alcoholism is an oppression fully owned by Satan. The change in Krista was startling. The sweetest, meekest girl I knew had become a different entity. I could talk for hours on this, but that's not the purpose of this talk. The purpose of this talk is to say how God pulls us from our hell. When he goes into the worst type of addictions, violence, wives that don't look at us anymore, kids off the rails, a daughter who's living with a man, our loneliness, our wounds, and he turns it all around. But I want to take you a little bit further into hell so you can understand how far God goes. As the years went by, it was always in the air. The wine, the weight of my powerlessness, Krista's ringed eyes, the growing chasm between us, the silence, and the flickering out of the easy joy and laughter from our earlier days. A pressing down sensation followed me everywhere I went. At work, among friends, at mass and prayer, and even among my children. I imagine we shared equally in the sensation of having entered a swallowing solitude, Krista and I, that was hollowing us out. In differing ways, this feeling of desolation had become imperialistic for both of us. Simply, we had just grown exhausted. Most mornings, I knelt in darkness at our bedside, and I looked at Krista asleep beneath the thick covers, and propelled by my deep love for her and desire to protect her, I quietly renounced the demons of wine and shame. I blessed her with holy water, and then asked God to reveal his will within the slow motion ruination of our marriage, of how I could help. I begged for the wisdom to understand the true path that would finally set Krista free. So before getting ready for work, I would sit down in my prayer chair, which I've been doing for, 15 years now, every morning, and would ask a handful of existential questions. God, how do I help, love, and serve my wife in her enslavement? God, what is my duty and God's will as her husband when she can't stand me? God, how do I die to myself to promote healing when she repeatedly rejects it? Answers never came. Answers never came. All that ever really came was the thought to continue practicing the customary heirlooms of prayer, fasting, daily rosaries, penances, and begging Jesus at the foot of the monstrance. And of course, practicing charity the best I could at home. Other than that, I had no idea what God's plan was. Krista had rejected all forms of AAA, no counseling, nothing. It was like a heavy tarpaulin was beginning to separate me from the world. I began to see wine as a savage destroyer of Krista, but me too. It was a poisonous and fast-moving cloud that was burning out the lungs of both of our souls. And I found myself becoming mortally afraid then because I didn't know how to stop it or stop her from buying it or drinking it. For years, she had hopscotched around, moving from liquor store to disguise her addiction. Besides prayer and dependence on God, I didn't know how to fight Satan for my wife. I remember praying with greater urgency then, but as the old pattern solidified, my pleas, my begging began to feel despairing and disorderly, like a distressed man lost at sea, who fires a flare that zigzags chaotically back into the ocean. A brief blaze of light that nobody sees. And our marriage grew quieter. And we seemed to walk past one another underwater. I wouldn't ask Krista to leave the home, and I knew she would never leave. Or she knew I would never leave. And as the days stretched on, Krista's isolation and binge drinking had taken on a frightening permanence that was accelerating. So within this wintertime in my house, Satan, red tides of diabolical taunts became shriller in my mind. You're stuck with her. It's killing your family. Your kids know. Krista hates you. God is dead in this. And she's drinking again tonight. As Satan mocked polyphonically, God, it seemed, didn't even whisper. But make no mistake, the man holding the microphone up here, Mr. Catholic guy, sometimes I was my own worst enemy in the fight. Following another bad night of Krista drinking, I often arrived home from work carrying an Arctic silence. Even though I knew Krista subconsciously screamed for me to walk through the door as a merciful and understanding man. And although I prayed at various parts of the day for wisdom and forbearance, I sometimes behaved at home as seemingly prayed for the opposite. I was living out the insidiousness of Paul's admission to the Romans in real time. So then it is no longer that I that do it, but sin which dwells within me. I will what is right, but I do not do it. I cannot do it. I do not do the good I want, but I do the evil that I do not want. There was promising stretches when Christus temporarily emerged like Lazarus, bright-eyed from the tomb. But instead of lavishing her with affirmation in the hope that really burned in me, I often tacked towards reservedness. Even as Krista's eyes showed with a glint of promise, mine, I imagine, might have looked guarded. Looking back, I see that I wasn't Thomas who doubted. I was Judas who betrayed. My tiredness with the patterns had made me an unwitting collaborationist to festering the pus in her wounds. Even though I knew it was up to Krista to quit her habits, I began to see how I was contributing to the rock, keeping the rock at the entrance of her tomb. It was with this awareness that I began to explore the dark corners in me that perhaps I had neglected when Krista began to secretly drink, and I began to contemplate my soul before God, where awareness and humiliation covered me like an acid bath. God became alarmingly alive, and suddenly, before the furnace of his gaze, there was no barriers or hiding places for me. I became aware of clusters of graceless gestures, laziness, and resentments that I clung to. But the garment really began to tear and come apart when I pulled the strings of fidelity and sacrificial love for Krista. I knew that Krista would never fully heal until I chose to love her without cost. And as a former journalist trained to investigate, I began to cautiously step into the unvisited places in me, and I began to force myself to lift and look between untouched rocks. And in those places, I opened up inquisitional deluges, hoping that probing questions would clear pathways to loving my suffering wife as God willed me to. And although answers still didn't come, I stuck to prayer. The problem is, the tempestuousness of our marriage had marred my intimacy with God through prayer. I had forgotten how to pray. This guy who's been praying for 45 years, I'd forgotten how to pray. I had to relearn the manner of falling under God's gaze in prayer. Just as I had as a child, Mom and Dad teach me at the bedside, just as I had to relearn how to walk after brain surgery. Strangely, I forgot how to pray. And the awareness was alarming because I knew in my dryness and feelings of exhaustion, they were expanding. They were rumbling black clouds that pushed across the sky. And in my prayerlessness, I knew the evil one would become even more unsparing with his work. I knew the demon would work at a fever pitch to lead me to emotionally dark places, to begin the process of systematic disintegration of hope. Bearing all this in mind moved me to devote myself fastidiously to learning the untamed operations of meditative prayer. I needed God in a way I never had before. So at night, thank God, at night, I prop my pillows up and begin to turn the pages of Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle, her masterpiece on mystical prayer. And the book for me became like a ribbon of peace in my soul. It was a lantern that lit my entire life, and took me to the interior life. And in the silence of my prayer, I began to understand that I needed to love Krista by doing one thing. I needed to love Krista by taking to the hard wood of the cross. I needed to love her with nails, with scourges, with no consolations, with all the friends having abandoned him at the cross. I needed to love Krista with nothing. Nothing. Why? Because that's how Jesus loved. What's the centerpiece of a man's identification? What's the centerpiece of a man's identification? It's Jesus Christ spread out on a cross, pouring out his love unconditionally for his wife and his family. It's the greatest portrait of love in the world is Jesus on the cross. And Teresa of Avila in that castle said, you want to come into my castle? You want to cross over the moat? You want to try to make an advancement into these little rooms? Then you must die and you must take to the hardwood. Because that's the only way this stinking thing's going to get better. You're a man. Teresa said, Kevin, you got to love Krista in the same fashion, same exact fashion that Jesus did from the cross. Give up all your emotional hang-ups. Surrender Krista. Surrender the future of your marriage. Surrender the lack of answers. Surrender it all to God. When I understood that a massive self-amputation and my fear and emotions was necessary, Jesus began to motion me towards Golgotha. Again, this comes from contemplative prayer, meditative prayer, mystical prayer. Every morning I would get up at 5 in the morning, light a candle, go to my prayer chair, make my colloquy, sit down, and wait on Jesus to speak. I had to crucify my fears. I had to crucify the unknown with no evidence of Christ's recovery to his cross. Give it to me. He asked me to nail my unknowingness to the cross. And I began to realize the degree to which I fully surrendered my unknowingness to the cross would be part and parcel to my freedom. And I was led to build something that changed my life. I was led to build a tiny cell in my soul. What is that? What is that? Each morning, awake at 5 a.m., I lit the candle and I took a dirt path to a hermitage in my soul. It looked like this for me. Here's what my little thatched cottage looked like. It was a small room below a low wood beam ceiling. There was 2 wooden benches right by a warming fire. There was always a teapot that simmered by the hearth fire below the image of the Sacred Heart. It was a very humble Irish home. I always pictured it in Donegal, on the coastline of Donegal, a little thatched cottage. All was quiet in the half-light, so I was going down into my soul. And it was in that thatched cottage in my soul that I just waited for Jesus to emerge. I just waited for him to sit on the bench across from me. Sometimes he didn't show up. But I didn't go anywhere. Where else could I go? Where else could I go? But sometimes Jesus would sit down on the bench and he'd have 2 cups of tea. And it was there that we began to speak about everything, heart to heart, without ever opening our mouths. It was this contemplative way that saved me. It calmed me, and it gave me the wisdom and the direction that I simply did not have. And in this contemplative way, whenever my mind began to stray and maybe I got a little worried about this, or there was something at work, or whenever I began to say, well, this prayer isn't working, and my mind was sort of strained into the borderline of distraction, I got into the habit of taming it with just a slowly repeated prayer. Holy Spirit, rest on me. Holy Spirit, rest on me. And then the little demons would sort of go away, and in the noiselessness, I began to comprehend and really to know for the first time in many years that God was mysteriously at work, as if he was noiselessly moving through dark places in me to bring light. And I imagined him then cutting away with scissors the wrong patterns of my thinking, like really with a small carving knife. Just kind of going through me. This didn't work with Krista. That didn't work. This didn't work. Just let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of that. And I gave way to him. And I heard him. And I saw what he was cutting away. And I spoke the small word, the words of the child. And I gently asked him to replace those broken places, those things that wasn't doing right, or the pain, with his love and graces. I needed to be sanctified for the fight ahead. And I repeatedly handed Krista and me to him, both of us, not just Krista, me too, as wounded lambs who had just survived the fangs of a wolf. And I told him that, Jesus, we lost the path, and we need you. And it was kind of humbling to see that I was on the back of the shepherd and Krista was right here too. What sort of a revolution of awareness was it for me that it wasn't just Krista that needed the shepherd's help from the wolf, but it was me too. I was draped over the shepherd soldier. We both needed it. And in time, I was no longer bringing the swallowing sea of unanswered prayers and my emotions into that mystical prayer. I was just meeting Christ in my inner cell, just speaking to him with my heart, almost like I took my hand, stuck it through my rib cage. It was just, Jesus, this is my heart. I know it's kind of nasty, but you get it. I don't need to say, this is my heart. If Krista had a bad night, I just calmly whispered to Jesus. I calmly whispered to him, I said, Jesus, it hurts. And I was candid about feeling alone. You know, as Jesus befriended the outcast and the poor and the wretchedly pained, I knew his eyes were riveted to me and my poverty and my aloneness. And in those moments, I imagined his eyes moistening, regarding me as he did beloved John as he rested his head against his heart. And in time, the locked doors had opened, and he had hand-led me down a new symmetry of understanding. If I remained obedient to God alone, I would love Krista with no conditions. That's dead and gone. As Christ looked upon me and loved me as a frail vessel, I was to do the same for Krista, whom I noiselessly Krista screamed for my love beneath her invisible sea of pain. She wanted me to love her despite it all. So I simplified my entire life around one idea. Everything was a choice between two outcomes. Crucified love, devoid of sensible consolations, would bring peace to a haunted time. Succumbing to my emotions would be prompts for the evil one to send down demons to destroy us both. And I knew my job was to take Krista to heaven. So I nailed myself to the cross. Thereafter, I knew beloved John's simple gesture of staying close to Christ's Sacred Heart would be far more efficacious than my years of fasting and penances, even rosaries and all that. I needed to rest my aching head as closely as I could against His Sacred Heart and do the best I could, because He was going to stick it into me. It opened up a revolution of newfound peace and direction. I had found the pearl of great price. I had entered into the field, that treasured field of contemplative prayer, where Jesus began to heal me. These years later, I've never stopped. I began to understand much later that God was always there in the dark night, and that He simply wanted me to cling to Him, even when He was silent and seemingly galaxies away. What He wanted from me was what the desert prophets of the Old Testament knew. Abraham, Elijah, Ezekiel, Moses, John the Baptist, they all understood the level of faith necessary during seemingly fatal conditions. These sand-whipped prophets transformed deserts into palaces. How do you do that? How does a wilderness become a palace? The wilderness wasn't a place for barrenness. It was a place to encounter God. For them, the desert wasn't a place to subdue and turn around the circumstances of their lives. I'm not going to turn Krista around. I don't know what to do. It's a desert. I'm not here to turn her around in this desert. No! It was to encounter God. That's why Ezekiel and all the rest took a walking stick and went further and further and further into the desert, because that's where God was. The desert wasn't a place for me to flee, just like it wasn't for them. It was a crucible of opportunity to walk more deeply into it, to encounter God, who told Jeremiah, "Call to me and I will answer you. And I'll tell you great and hidden things, which you have not known." The teacher never hides himself from the suffering one who seeks him, as if he's the only hope in the world. And of course, God is the only hope in the world. The evil one wanted Krista's soul. He wanted my marriage. He wanted my 3 children. He wanted to burn it all down. And the metaphorical hell we were living in, that wasn't enough. He wanted all of us in his real hell. That's what he's after. This home feels like hell. I don't care about that. I want you burning I want all of you given up. I want you in my real kingdom. Without contemplative prayer in my life and returning to this thatched cottage to rest my head up against His Sacred Heart, Satan, I believe, would have gotten it all. Men, this is a story with a happy ending. How much time do I got? Clock? 10 minutes? Okay. We'll try and wrap it up in 5. I wish we could open this up to a forum of questions after some of the stuff I heard today. I'm kind of glad that the story is ending before I get to the fairy tale, the real fairy tale. I'm going to end like this. I haven't addressed heaven. Oh my God, it's my hottie. Yeah, that's her without wine for 4 years. Somebody take a picture and send it to me. Chris is going to be like, my hair's all messed up. No, I want to tell you something that happened. So this is my 5th book. I'm working on another book now. And you know, a writer, they always kind of understand how they're going to write their book. You know, I'm not one of these guys who has outlines. I sort of have this stuff. Sometimes I'll write things down, and I sort of know what I'm going to do. And when finally Krista convinced me to write this book, I said, sweetie, are you okay? Because I'm putting your stuff out on the street. I mean, this stuff's on the street. Kevin, that's my old life. I'm a new creation. That's the old skin, brother. Again, I want to expose myself so I can expose what a muscular priest resembles, who took a spiral staircase down into my wounds during COVID-19, who wasn't afraid, and brought me back. So Kevin, write the book. So I said, all right, well finally, 6 months later, I started to write, and I thought, hopefully this is interesting to you, because man, is it interesting to me. I thought in my head, by around chapter 4 or chapter 5, that I would have gotten all the bad stuff out of the way, right? All the stuff on the street, and I'd get to Father Flume, the superhero, in chapter 5, and then I get to write about nothing I talked about in today's talk. And what he did is nothing short of, there's not a word for it. I don't know what, there's a word for it, I don't know what it is, but it was transcendent. By the way, as I mentioned, he's a hermit now. He's a consecrated hermit who asked his bishop in Washington, D.C. if he could leave his role as a pastor, because he didn't tell the bishop this, but he wanted to give over the remainder of his life as a holocaust to God, as an expiation to God for recovery of the priesthood. It pained him deeply how the church responded in 2020. He saw the diabolic come in when the sacraments were shut down, and BLM and Antifa and everywhere our streets were on fire. He saw Satan whistle for his chorus and say, go get them, guys. They shut it all down. No protectors. Go get them. Father Flume said, no, I'm gonna disappear and live a life of mortification, of penance, of severe asceticism. I don't want to go into the hermit's life, but I think you know it's rising at 3 a.m., 3:30 a.m., starting the first nocturne. Basically, he lives, his cell is the size of your childhood bedroom, where he lives his entire life, essentially in front of a monstrance, as St. Anthony in the desert. So of course right now, he is fighting Satan. I promise you this, Satan and Father Martin Flume are hard at it. And you'll see if you read the Hermit that he was physically attacked by Satan. People know it at the parish, and I don't want to get into the story, but it's fascinating. So anyway, chapter 5, yeah, that's when I write about this hero, Father Flume, saving my wife, and I can write about the glories of marriage. The kids are doing great, marriage is great, we're on our honeymoon, Krista and I have never been better. Yeah, Krista, let's go for it. I'm going to write about what a holy priest did during COVID. I got you. Got to chapter 4 and chapter 5, and I hadn't gotten to COVID-19. I hadn't gotten to Father Flume, and then chapter 5 became 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I hadn't got to COVID-19 or Father Flume, and I did not understand what was happening. I just kept writing. And again, writing was cutting a vein. Writing was cutting a vein. It was going down to Molokai. It was going down into ugly places. So I finally finished the book. Thank goodness. I finally finished the book, and I gave the manuscript to 4 people I respect, a theologian, a couple authors, and someone else that I really respect their vision. I said, hey guys, I just wrote something, and I'm kind of scared, man. I put it out there. This thing is nuts. Would you read it? Well, what's it about, Kevin? Well, it's about what a holy priest did during COVID to save my wife. What happened to your wife, guys? Let me tell you. So I told the story and said, okay, that sounds like a good book. So one by one, they all got back to me at different times, and they all said essentially the same exact thing. They said this, Kevin, I know what you thought you did. I know what you wanted to write about, what Father Flynn did for Krista, and what the witness of a holy priest looks like, and what they do during these times, but you didn't write that book. And I thought the first guy lost it. He didn't see. He lost the plot. He didn't get it. And then the second guy, and they all said the same thing. They said, Kevin, you wrote a book about the dark night of marriage and what a spouse does to never leave that spouse aside. And you wrote about the machinations that a dead man does to rise every morning and stick his nose in the fight and never give up. Kevin, you wrote a book about marriage. And when the fourth person said it, I said, oh my gosh, I didn't write this book. The Holy Spirit wrote this stinking book. I believe, again, I'm not a supernaturalist, that this book is not of my doing. The many people that have reached out, the book just came out a few weeks ago. Ignatius Press published it. The many people that have reached out have all said the same thing. My kid's on drugs. My wife hasn't looked at me in years. I haven't had a job in 3 years. I got no money. I'm depressed. My life stinks. My daughter is an atheist. You laid out something that shows me a pinhole of light and how God can make it into a torch. Thanks for giving me hope. Again, it's not the old sports writer. This isn't me. The Holy Spirit allowed me to mourn for the first time. As I wrote that book, I mourned. I had never mourned, right? I guess guys are like that. So those chapter 1 through chapter 11 was me essentially bleeding out and crying with every sentence to finally get to the fairy tale. To finally get to the fairy tale. Look at that. Look at that smile. That was about 2 or 3 weeks before he left and disappeared into a forest where he's confronting Satan for the rest of his life to heal you. The universal church. He's engaged, that man right there is engaged with Satan right now to heal you. I've come to believe that he's one of the most important people on the face of the earth. And one of my best friends is Father Dan Leary. He's a chaplain to 20,000 of the poorest kids in the world at boys' towns and girls' towns. He doesn't stop. 16, 17, 18 hours a day. He doesn't stop working with these bullied kids. This guy right here, I'm sorry, he's got the nod. He's died to everything he ever knew. He's amputated and annihilated every comfort in his life to fight for you. Drinks his water from a rain catcher. His sustenance is a little garden. The penances that I know are unspeakable. Sleeps on the floor. And he doesn't stop begging for renewal to this church and this world. And Satan doesn't like it. So in your spare time, you think about it, pray for this guy, Father Martin Flume, because this guy is William Wallace. This guy is William Wallace. All for the healing of the world. Thank you very much.